Hi, my name's Dan Humberg, and this is a Harvest Fires instructional video. I'm sitting in the hole between the engine and the grain tank on a CaseIH 8120 model 11 year combine. I'm going to show you how to install the tin kit for a the tin set for a Firestop kit on the exhaust or on the engine system in this machine. Before we begin the actual installation, I always start these with a little bit of a cautionary statement. The Firestop kit is very effective at stopping the fires that occur, or that ignition that occurs at the exhaust system in volatile crops, particularly in sunflowers, but other volatile crops as well. The vast majority of the fires that you find on, or the smolders that you find in your machine, probably start at that exhaust system. And this system interrupts that ignition or prevents that ignition of that dust, and it's very effective at doing that. However, I have to caution you that it cannot prevent every possible smolder on your combine, because there are multiple ignition sources available on the machine. You can have a hot bearing, you can have an electrical short, you can have friction around or material gets wound around a shaft, you can have a failing alternator, you can have lots of different things that can potentially give you a ignition of dust. However, this kit has been found to dramatically reduce the number of smolders that you find on the machine. Just be aware that you can still have a smolder, and so you still need to be vigilant on the machine for that possibility. Okay. Like I said, we're going to do the tin installation on this machine. I'll demonstrate it here. I'm on a dealer lot, so I'll put this on and then immediately take it back off again, and I won't put every screw in that I could put in when we assemble it, because I just don't want to take all day with the video. But you should try and put all of the screws in that you can possibly get in as you do your installation. There are a few things that we kind of need to do before you actually begin the work with the tin itself. I'm going to point some of those things out here. I've done them ahead of time, but I can tell you what they are and what it takes. First thing is there's a piece of sheet metal in here in the 8120 and most of the Case machines right here, right behind the engine. It is designed to take the blast that comes from the radiator fan and direct a lot of that air right at the turbocharger and the exhaust system. I think the idea was probably a valid idea, but it was to flush any dust off of that area so that dust can't accumulate and sit on those hot components. In the case of the really volatile crops like flowers, that dust will ignite when it hits the turbo or even comes really close to the turbocharger, and so that directing that air there is kind of counterproductive. In this case, that piece of metal is up here. I've taken it off already to save time. There are 3 bolts that hold it on, one here, and one over on the radiator fan shroud over here. In order to get that out of there, once you pull those 3 bolts off, you have to take this coolant line. It's a coolant overflow line that goes to this big torpedo full of, I guess it takes overflow coolant. Anyway, you have to drop it out of this rubber restraining grommet here. There's one here, and there's another one back behind that tank, and you have to loosen the bolt up there quite a bit, and then you can pull that bottom line down out of that rubber grommet. I put it back up in there now that I've gotten the shield out of the way here, but you have to drop that down in order to get that shield out of here, because it straddles this line. And once you get the 3 bolts out, you drop the right hand end, or the downstream end of the engine, down into the hole next to you behind the grain tank, and then you can snake the fan end of that sheet metal up over this line when it's dropped down and get it up and out of here. In the case, if you're putting the Firestop kit on your machine, that shroud will never go back on, or at least won't go back on until you decide to take this kit off if you move the kit to another machine or something like that. But that shroud comes out and it stays out because it actually interferes with the tin kit around the exhaust system here, and so we just leave it off. Okay, the other thing that I have to do on this kit or this machine before we can actually do any tin installation is make an adjustment on the exhaust manifold here. You're looking down on the turbocharger exhaust turbine, and this is the turbocharger compressor turbine. This one's aluminum, that one's cast iron. Notice the aluminum one here comes extremely close to the exhaust manifold. In the model 11 year of the 120, they rolled the turbo up in. They put a different piece in here and rolled this turbo up in closer to the exhaust manifold. I assume they wanted to make it more compact or something. Anyway, that brought this compressor turbine almost in contact with the exhaust manifold here. And so in order to be able to get our tin kit, which encloses the manifold but does not enclose the exhaust or the compressor turbine here, we have to kind of go through that space. And there are two there's an expansion joint in there, and there are two clamps, T-bolt style clamps here that hold that expansion joint onto the exhaust manifold. And in this case, on this particular one, they had one of the clamps kind of up here on top, and the other one was kind of facing up and down here. On the right-hand side, there's a pair that is also serves the same purpose on the right-hand side of the manifold. And I can show you those two here. This is the exhaust pipe down here, and there's the manifold and those two clamps. Notice the T-bolt clamps are pointed kind of downward. That just makes it easy for them to install them. It's really neat and all that. Looks like it's supposed to be that way. But those things can get in the way of our tin kit, especially on the left-hand side here. So I've taken a 5mm socket, or a 5mm Allen wrench, loosened this T-bolt up here and rotated this one up to where the T-bolt is level, pointed straight at the block. And that keeps it low enough that it won't interfere with our tin on top, and it gets as much of it out of the way as we can here by the compressor. The other one, because the bolt was pointed the other way, I loosened that one up and rolled it down underneath, and so it's pointed flat underneath towards the block, and then tightened that one back up. I counted the turns on these, and so I backed them out about 4 turns. Or 5 turns, but whatever. I counted the number of turns that I backed them to loosen them up, and then I tap on that a little bit with a ball peen hammer in a couple places, and it will kind of break loose, and you can tap the clamp around or push it around with the Allen wrench or whatever. But anyway, rotate it in place and then tighten it back up, and I tightened it back up the same number of turns that I loosened it, and then I gave it probably another quarter or half a turn to make sure that it was tight and that I wasn't leaving this thing in any way loose. But that prepares the manifold here to do the best we can in terms of fitting around it. We're already going to have a little opening in our box to accommodate this compressor turbine. So that brings us to starting the installation of the tin itself. You're looking right down at the root of the turbocharger and the exhaust manifold across the back from the engine side. You're on the engine side of the affair right now. So I'm going to start with the first piece of tin. I've actually got an assembly of tin here to start with, and this will save us some time. It's piece number, I think it's number 1 is the top piece in this set. Yeah, it's number 1 is the long piece that covers the top of the exhaust manifold. And to that piece, let me just take you down and show you this here. To that long piece, I have assembled the upper half of the 2 pieces that surround the exhaust turbine, and then I've got this piece number 10 over here that joins the right-hand side of the manifold cover with that same upper half of the exhaust turbine cover, and I've screwed those on. Now I don't have all the screws in, but you could put all of the screws in there and it wouldn't hurt at all to do that. We can put this much together before we start to put anything on. I wanted to try to have this one where my hand is over here in place as well, that cover there, but we can't fit that in quite yet. It just won't fit until we have this in place. So now if we carefully snake this thing in place here, it will drop down just like that. Okay, I'm going to point something out. As I have this in place, and it's pretty much in place, I can feel contact underneath here with those clamps on the expansion joint on the exhaust manifold on the right hand side. I'll take it back out. I can feel my tin work hitting on these clamps here, and so I'm going to take a little while or a little minute here, and I'll go off camera, but I'll loosen these up and slide them down and around and snug them back up again so that they're out of the way. You may have to do that on your installation as well. I'll be back. Alright, I've got this set of clamps rolled down underneath so that the T-bolt or the bolt part of it is facing kind of back towards the block. And now they're out of the way, and we can go back to putting this piece in place. Alright, it'll drop down to where it almost sits right on top of the exhaust turbine here. The left-hand side of it will be outside of the turbocharger bearing or right up against the compressor face here. It should actually kind of seal up against the compressor face. The right-hand side will just surround your exhaust pipe, and it should fit pretty close on here in this case. Now there are three slots cut in this flange on the top of this, and they all three of them line up with an open bolt hole in the block or the head. Those holes will accept an 8mm bolt. I have one here, and I can put one in on the left side here, just about 6 inches to the left of the exhaust turbine, or just past the compressor turbine. That's an 8mm bolt with a 13mm socket, or requires a 13mm wrench or socket. I'm not going to make that really tight right now because I may want to be able to shift the piece a little bit. Got another one, and I'll start one of them on one of the holes to the right hand side too. Okay, I've snugged that up. I've got it close, but it's not really tight. Okay, there's 3 holes there. You can put 3 bolts in, but 2 bolts will certainly hold it up against the block all right. When we tighten that up, there's so many other things that restrain this that it really can't go anywhere once we have it mounted. I apologize if it's difficult for you to see real well in here. I've got bright sunshine coming in over the top of me. I can't control that, and so we get a real lots of dark and lots of shiny and light in here. The next piece we're going to try to put on is piece number 9. It fits over the left side of the manifold, and will slip down in like this. Looks like it's going to fit in place all right. I'm using the short bit I've got here is a little Milwaukee number 2 square drive. I like that one best. It tends to hold the screws best, but sometimes you need a longer one. I've got about a 6-inch extension bit here. Okay, I can put 5 screws in along the top here. I really don't need all 5 of them myself because I'm going to take this back off. There are 2 screws around the end too, and they're going to be a challenge to get on. I think you can probably get them in. They will line up with especially if you bent your tin carefully and the tin fits together well, you can get those in. But there is some stuff in the way here on the left-hand end of the manifold. If you can see down here, we've got junk around right off the end of it, some coolant things, and I'm not sure what all else. But there are holes in the end of that piece, and if you can get either a stubby driver or a long one in there and pull that end piece in and get at least one of those screws in and pull that together, that would be good. The next 2 pieces we would like to get in place are the bottom parts of this enclosure around the exhaust manifold. So number 2 here should go under the left hand. It's got this bracket on here that will attach to the block, and I'm hoping that we can slip that in place and line things up. We're trying to put this piece in place, number 2 on the bottom underneath the exhaust manifold on the radiator end, and I was running into interference, and the piece that was interfering was a couple places. One is that the oil line that serves the turbocharger bearing, it's about a 1/2 inch diameter steel line, comes up through this area, and it was bumping in here. Now that line is flexible or bendable enough that you can shift it a little bit and bend it a little bit if you need to. I don't like to do that very much, but if it's close you could adjust it and then not have to trim anything here. I trimmed a tab that came through here and wrapped up. Looks like it's going to run into that line anyway, so I cut that off right here. It'll leave a little more of an opening than I'd like, but not too much. The other thing is that this compressor housing was running into this here, not allowing this to go fully into place, and so I trimmed this opening here out a little bit farther that way and trimmed a little off this tab so that we got a little more clearance there, and then we'll go back and try it again. The other piece that we were trying to put in place here, this piece number 9 that goes over this, has a cutout here, and that is to fit around the outside, to fit around this compressor line when it's in place there. And I opened this up probably only about 1/8 of an inch with a tin snips to give me a little more clearance there, so that doesn't hit against that as well. It was interfering. You're going to probably need a tin snips because there's some of these places where it fits close. I would like it to fit as close as possible, but sometimes you got interference and you just have to open it up a little bit. It's very difficult to make the design such that it fits everyone perfectly all the time. For instance, that oil line never seems to be exactly in the same place on 2 machines, so you're going to have to either shift it by bending it or open up the tin a little bit to accommodate it. So I'll put this stuff back on now. I'll bring you back in. Alright, we're going to try again to see if we can get piece number 2 in on the bottom of this. I slide it in from the left underneath the air intake to the compressor turbine. There's a coolant line on the left end. No, it's the block heater, I think, on the left end that I have to work around. Alright, the piece on the bottom, the flange tucks inside of this box, and so you may have to lift the box up a little bit or pull it out a little bit in order to get that piece tucked in there. And then the flange is on the back side of that that long strip, that piece we just put in on the bottom, the mate to this one, the one on the left end. These flat tabs go in over the top of a kind of a bar that's cast into the block and slide in between that and the head. There's like a little bit of a machine slot there, and so you have to fiddle around with it a little bit, but when it finds that spot it'll slide up in place there. And now I need my little stubby driver in order to reach these. I'll come back. I don't know if you can see this very well, but we put that piece in place here that covers the front face of the left side of the exhaust manifold. It slips up in from the bottom inside the, or I take it back, I put the bottom piece in and it slips up inside this front face piece here. Got that in there. I've gotten 2 screws in it with this little super stubby square drive screwdriver. I could probably reach at least the 3rd one, maybe the 4th one, and then I'd have to go around the end. But this screwdriver makes it possible to reach some of those in real tight spaces where you can't with a longer driver. So I got that one in place well enough to demonstrate the install. It's just a matter of trying to fit in more screws. The next piece to go in would be this one. It's listed as number 3 here. That'll go in from the right hand end, and it'll also go in. These tabs will fit in the slot between the head and the block. These tabs will butt up against the casting boss in the lower of the block itself. This piece, this tab on the end, should lay on top of the tab, the extension of the piece that we just put in. So this one, we want this to go on top, and then there's a place for a pair of screws to go in underneath there. Once we get this one in place on the right hand end, then we could put on that bracket that screws onto these 4 screw holes here, and that will provide us with a hole over a place in the engine block where we can bolt that side on. The one we just put in place on the bottom of over here already had a bracket on it, and so there's a slot there that should fit. I'll see if I can get you down to where you can see that. I got the piece underneath the left side here tucked in and screwed in like I told you briefly before. I wanted to try and show you where that bracket lines up with a hole in the block under there, but I couldn't get the camera in a position where it can actually see that clearly. You'll just probably have to either bend over and look under here or feel with your hand, but in fact where that little bracket sticks down off the bottom of that bottom piece, there is a hole in a raised flat boss on the engine block that's tapped for number 8mm by 1.25. Anyway, it's a standard 8mm bolt. We'll provide you with some of those, and you can put a bolt and a washer in there and it will pull the bottom of this box tightly against the block there or hold it in place. The next piece we'll put on is number 3 here. It goes in from the right and will slip in place under the right side of the manifold. This tab again goes on top of the previous one, and then there are 2 screw holes here. When I did this on the bench, I found out that later I've got a tab that covers up here that will interfere with this outer screw hole, so we can probably only do this one in the back first, and then when we put the turbo wrap on, it'll put a screw in through here as well, and that will help tie this together. But right now I have to reach under and try and get that back one. First task is simply to get the piece snaked in place. I'm having trouble getting it all the way in place. I'm finding that oil line that serves the turbocharger bearing is bumping into this corner here. I'm going to trim a little bit of this corner off in order to make sure that we can clear that. I'll try again. There, that piece finally snapped in place. You just have to find out where it's hooking or hanging up and shift it around until it finds that slot where it's got to sit into, and it'll butt up against that block and get it on top of the piece on this end. It's now fitting around that oil line a little bit, and now we can try and get a couple screws in the bottom in place there. Okay, I got a couple of screws in there. We'd have more to put in around the end. I ended up using this stubby driver again to put in these screws. And I hit a couple that I hadn't tapped before because I didn't put them all in when I put this together on the bench, and that is something that is a bad thing to do. You need to make sure that all those screw holes are pre-tapped, because it's murder to try and make a screw cut a hole through there with this little driver when you have no leverage. So do it all on the bench beforehand. The next piece I would put on is number 12. It's this bracket under the right hand end that will give us an attachment point on the block down below. And it's better to just duck down here on the right hand side. You may have noticed I'm wearing a hat when I started this thing. The hat isn't so much because it's stylish, it just gives me a little bit of warning that I'm about to bump my head on something that's really hard and unforgiving. Well, that was surprisingly easy, and it lined up and went on there. And so now there'd be a place down below here that we could put another bolt in that will hold the right hand end of this against the block. I won't do that right now because it's not critical that I do that right now. It's easy. I guess I can start a bolt in there. I'll give you some 8mm, short 8mm bolts with the kit. Before you start your installation, I would take an air compressor and blow out these threaded holes in the block, because they're likely going to be full of chaff or dust or dirt, and the bolts go in really hard when that's the case. Our next piece to go in is listed as number 5 here. This is going to be the bottom left side of the turbocharger up against the compressor housing here. I kind of crawled underneath and did a little bit of a test fit here, and I find that if I open up bend this tab here out just a little bit, that I can go in at an angle, snake this in behind the oil line that goes up towards the compressor bearing or the turbocharger bearing, and then slip it around this way so that oil line comes down through here. Now I looked at it and it probably clears, but I'm going to trim a little off of this tab to make sure that I have clearance around that oil line. If it's getting noisy in here, it's because I'm on a dealership lot and they're running a combine or something out behind me to I don't know, clean it out or something. Anyway, I'm going to trim this just a little bit. Okay, now we can go in there, snake that behind the oil line, pivot it around this way, bring this up to the inside of this upper half base so it fits flat against the inside, and there are 2 screw holes here, and we can get at least one of those screws in to hold it, maybe both of them. And then we can bend this tab back around because we got a piece that'll probably try and attach to that later on. I may or may not be able to get screws through this side, but if possible, I want to get this tucked up behind the piece on the left, the upper piece, that piece behind it, and this one on the inside of it. Because if I can get a screw through back there, it'll go through and bite into this go through this one and bite into this one. So I'll see if I can do that. Right, I did another fit of that part, and it's going to work in there around that oil line that serves the compressor. This tab here that has the cutout for the return line, I folded up tight against the inside wall here of this thing to give it a little bit more room. And I still need a little bit more clearance around the back side of this here. I want like a 1/4 of an inch clearance around that line, and it's about to make contact there, so I'm just going to cut a little bit of a recess there. The next piece is one of the next pieces is going to overlap this and go around that area anyway, so we'll cover that oil line from 2 sides. Now I think we can go back and put it in place. I can only get one of these 2 screws in. This one, if I go through this one, it's going to hit the compressor head on. So I can go through this one and hold it in place with that. Not sure whether we'll get screws in there or not. I repositioned you. You're looking down from the muffler down the exhaust pipe. I'm going to put the next piece in place. It's piece number 7, and it goes underneath the exhaust pipe and comes up from the bottom, and it will go generally outside of the... Okay, we'll slip this up from below. It'll kind of snap in place here, I think. And we should be able to get a screw in. Alright, that one fit pretty well. Next one is a big step. We got this piece that'll wrap around the turbocharger. I've got a place for the oil line that goes up to the turbo bearing and one for it comes back. And I've got little slits cut away from those, and I'm going to use the pliers to bend those down so that they parallel the line, so that they can't be a sharp edge against that line. I'll come back when I've got that fit, and then we'll show putting that piece in place. Alright, I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but I've bent those pedals down about 90 degrees, and so it's kind of a smooth face on those that would contact the line if we get any contact. I'd really like to have a little clearance there, but on the chance that they do make contact, I want it to be the smooth face of those pedals. I'm going to dive down underneath to get that put in place and make sure I've got clearance there. Okay, this line has good clearance around here. This one, the line wants to sit right down in here, and I still need to push this in a little bit farther. So I need to extend these little cuts back in here a little farther, maybe another 1/4 of an inch at least, and bend those tabs down. Alright, I test fit that again, and after bending those pedals, cutting those pedals deeper, I cut them a little bit deeper in there, and then I bent them down, and then I trimmed them off so that we don't have long teeth sticking down there. And now I put that piece back in, and it fits pretty well. Once I have it in place, I'm going to go down there and put a screw in, probably on each side. And then the screws that I'm going to work on probably after that are the ones that screw up from the bottom into the bottom of this piece in the back. Those are going to be probably the hardest ones to reach, and if I don't want to tighten too many of the others in place, because then it makes it hard to force those into alignment. If we kind of start with those and get those connected in the back, then you can kind of work your way around here, and as you put more screws in, the more holes just line up, and it gets easier and easier to put the screws in here. But I'm going to try and start kind of under the back. I may put one in on the side lightly anyway to try to hold it in place, but then go under the back. I'll come back after trying that. Alright, after a little bit of struggle, but I managed to get that piece fit in there, put a couple screws in on the bottom, and then worked some screws in on the, well, I got the one in on the right hand end of the tab that goes up against the bottom of this, found that hole, and then ended up fitting several other screws in, and eventually I could get all of the ones in the back and to bite in, and that can be a bit of a struggle, and you could have to, one of the things I would recommend is that you have these pieces really well fit together before you tackle it on the machine. Make sure your bends and stuff are such that it really wants to go to the right spot before, so that you don't have to bend it in place to find a screw hole. Anyway, I've got it on there, and once you got a couple of screws on the bottom, then you can work your way around here, and as you come around, the next screw holes will line up as you put one in. I haven't put all of them in, but I put a bunch of them in. And so we've got that wrap on here. After I did that, I tightened these bolts up on the block. Before that, I had them kind of loose because it allows you to do some wiggling to help things align better. Once I've done that and screwed this together and I've tightened up that bolt, this whole assembly is pretty much locked on here. It doesn't have a lot of play anymore. And that's what we want. We want it in place. Then I also reached around underneath with my fingers, and you could go down and look at it as well. And I find that it feels like I've got clearance around the oil lines, both the small oil line that serves the turbo bearing and the bigger one that allows fuel or allows oil to return from it. Now, there might be one place under here where I feel contact between that tab and that return line, and I wouldn't hesitate to take this thing back off
and adjust that, or go down and perhaps if it's a little pedal that I've cut that I can bend a little farther away so that it has clearance, I would do that. But I really don't want those things contacting the oil lines. I'd like to have a little bit of clearance there. And any place you do have contact, you want it to be parallel contact and not an edge contacting that oil line. Okay, we go on to the next piece with the exhaust to cover the exhaust pipes. Alright, the next piece is going to cover up this exhaust pipe, the lower part of it. We've got a little extension to go on the top part. I've actually assembled 3 pieces. We've got piece 13, 14, and 16. These are the inside, outside, and top of this exhaust pipe cover. You can pre-assemble those where you've got room, and then drop it over the top of the exhaust system there, like that. I'm going to take a hand driver and put a screw or 2 in here at the base end. I made some marks with a Sharpie on the bench when I had this assembled, and so I can kind of line up those marks, and when they're reasonably aligned, then a screw should go through and find the hole that it's supposed to go into. Okay, that's a good start. I've got 3 screws across the top here. There are screws to go in here, I think 2 or 3 along this interface there, and then 3 on the outside and probably 3 on the bottom. The bottom piece isn't in place yet, but it will be. In this case, it takes either an extended bit or that long driver bit that I use to reach from here back in there and hit some of those. And so that's one of the places where you really need a long driver. I also have a couple holes that I'm having trouble lining up here, but the pieces, once I get the bottom piece in place, if those holes won't line up, I may just shoot screws through. Since they're self-drilling and tapping, just drive them right through there. Because the laser didn't cut these dotted lines real well, our bends aren't quite as crisp, and sometimes that forces some of the pilot holes out of alignment. But that's the box that goes around that. I'll put a couple more screws in to hold it in place, and then we'll put the bottom piece on. The next piece I'm going to work with is number 15. It will go on the bottom of the enclosure around that exhaust system. It's got a flange that bends down. That'll go against the bottom face of the turbocharger cover. What you need to note so you don't get started and find out you've got it wrong is these pilot holes on this flange are large ones. That means this flange goes on the outside of the box back here on the bottom, but the rest of these pilot holes are the smaller ones. In fact, all of the rest of these, I believe, are the smaller ones. That means all of these tabs except this one back here tuck inside the bottom of this box. And so it may take a little bit to squish it in place there and get this one on the outside and these on the inside, but that's what you need to do in order for it to be assembled the way it was designed. I'll go offline to do that. Alright, we put that bottom piece in the bottom of this enclosure on the exhaust pipe. We can run screws. They're pretty easy to reach on this side. When you get around to the bottom back side, you have to use this stubby driver for most of it, at least for part of it. You can reach some of these others maybe with something else. But as long as you've assembled it carefully on the bench, then the screw holes line up and you can put it together there. And that wasn't terribly difficult in this case. That leaves us with 2 pieces left. Number 17 here. I don't know that I showed this when I did the folding video, and I need to do a little addition to that to show how you fold this piece. It's really not that complicated. I think the piece is actually symmetrical, so it doesn't matter whether you fold it this way or the other way. It would work either way, I think. But it's a kind of a shell that will go over the last part of the exhaust pipe there, and this curved face will come up near the muffler. and these tabs on the top, and there will be one on a piece that was stick in the bottom too. Those tabs can come probably all the way up to the muffler and be bent to fit against the muffler itself. So we bend this around with those tabs underneath. Those will hold the last piece here. I'll show you that piece. That piece is just a simple plate with a flange bent on the end. It's going to install inside this other one eventually. We have to put the top one in place first and slip this one in. And you can put screws through from the bottom up into here to hold this in place. But now we have two flanges. One can come up against the bottom of the muffler and one can go up against the top, and then we can let the air that we're pushing up through here leak out around this curved area here. So that's the concept of this last piece. It's not terribly difficult to put on. We'll bring it up here, spread the bottom apart, straddle the other box that we've done, slide it up to the upper end, kind of right up against the muffler, and there are holes in the sides where you can attach it, and you can use those holes. On this particular machine, that's going to leave about a 1/2 or 3/4 of an inch gap around here where the curved surface is between that and the muffler. The tabs up here can come up right tight against the muffler, so you can use those holes to put that in place. But before we screw those in, we need to put this piece in place on the bottom because we need to spread that apart a little bit to fit this in. So I'll do that. I'm going to duck under here. Okay, I have that piece loosely set in place, and I've got a screw hole that's lined up on the right side here, and I'm going to make use of that while it's there. And I got a second screw in the side. I had to lift up on this whole assembly a little bit to get the holes to line up. There are two other holes on this side that you can probably utilize similarly to kind of lock this in place. And then it's a matter of going around underneath and getting that bottom piece slipped into place so that we can line up the holes for it, squeeze the bottom together a little bit, and put those 4 screws in there. And then you can, if you need to, you can bend these tabs so that they fit up against the muffler, and that gives us just a little gap to dump the last air out up there around the muffler. I would come back. I would check one more time to make sure I've got clearance around the oil lines. I'm going to point you up underneath so you can maybe see that. There, we're looking up underneath here, and you can see where those 2 oil lines penetrate the, if I can rotate the camera correctly. There you can see where those lines come through that piece in the bottom of the turbo wrap. And so you want to check those and make sure that you've got clearance there, and you can bend those little tabs out if you need to farther to make sure you've got good clearance around those lines. That's kind of important because I don't want you ever to damage those lines to the point where they would leak oil or lose oil from the engine. The other thing that I recommend you do is I will provide you with a roll of aluminum foil tape. They call it duct tape. It's for sealing up HVAC ducts, heating, ventilation, air conditioning ducts. Anyway, it's a real good sticky tape, and it's a stiff aluminum foil, so you can also bend it to fit. And I put strips of that over these rows of screws here, and maybe over here, and down there, everywhere you can reach, kind of. I put a strip of that aluminum tape. It will help seal up parts so that we don't lose air prematurely in the system. But the other thing that it does is it keeps these sheet metal screws from vibrating loose, or if they want to vibrate, they can come loose a little bit, but they can't come out because the tape keeps them down in place. And so I don't want, there's going to be vibration here, and that sheet metal screws don't have a lot to bite into here, so that tape helps in that regard. The other thing you can use it for is if you think you got too big a gap, like around the oil lines underneath there, that tape won't hurt anything. So you can tuck that in around there and kind of seal up so that we don't dump our air in here and lose most of it right out the beginning. I might, there's a small gap in here where we fit around the compressor turbine housing, and I would probably try and fit a strip of that tape in here just to tighten that up a little bit, because the air going in here, coming out here, hasn't done us much good yet. I would rather it flow to the end of the manifold cover, flow to the other end, and flow out along the exhaust pipe here. So anywhere you think you've got gaps that are going to dump a lot of air out, you can tape them up a little bit with that aluminum tape. I don't think it'll hurt anything. I don't know how difficult it would make to take it apart if you need to service this someday, but really what's inside of here aren't components that you have to service very often anyway. So that's the procedure for sealing that up. I may make a little video about how to connect this up here too. I don't have the piece with me to show right now, but what I use to get air into here is it's called a starting collar from HVAC, from heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. So a 4-inch starting collar has little tabs. It's a steel, galvanized steel collar that'll stick out a couple of inches anyway. And it has fingers on the bottom, and you can bend about 4 of those out 90 degrees, and then the rest of them go down in through here, and then you reach down through the collar and you bend them out on the inside so that they tend to keep it from coming out. And then the 4 tabs that we have on the outside, I shoot a screw through those to hold those down onto this surface. And then I use some of that aluminum tape to tighten up eliminate leaks around there. Then onto that aluminum, or that galvanized starting collar, we put a galvanized twistable or sliding 90-degree curve fitting for HVAC purposes. That allows us to come up out of here and either go left or right to get around this oil fill cap for the engine, the fill cap on top of the valve cover. And so we'll probably come up here and come back a little bit and then go up over the top of these lines. And so that gives us some flexibility. So we'll attach that one onto the starting collar with 3 or 4 screws, and then tape that joint, and then bring it up here and get it shaped, and we'll slip that into a rubber 90-degree elbow that will go over the top of the valve cover here and point us out that direction. And then I'll usually put 2 or 3 screws through the rubber into that galvanized fitting, and then I tape that joint too, so we're tight coming into here. I don't want to lose air before we get it in here. And from that point on, we go with 4-inch aluminum intake pipe, from rubber fitting to rubber fitting with aluminum pipe all the way back to the blower that sends our clean air this way. So that's the procedure for mounting that. I may do a video of that and post that on the website just so that everybody knows how I would do that. You can do it differently if you want. Anyway, that's how we're going to get the air in here. Once it's in here, we can control to some extent how much air comes out where by how far open we open these keyhole ducts. So we got keyhole here, here, and one underneath. Some of those I have to open up because the laser didn't cut them all the way through. But I would open those at the end of the manifold just a little bit. Open those up just a little bit so that we force some air to flow along the manifold and come out the ends there. The rest of the air will flow in around the turbo and then go out along the exhaust pipe or down along those oil lines that'll leave in some of those gaps there too. But we want to push lots of air in there and then let it flow to all parts of the box and kind of keep dust from having any chance to come back in anywhere. Alright, that's the procedure for a Case 8120 model 11 year or higher. If you have a model 10 year or younger than that, earlier than that, we use the kit from an 8010. It's the same engine in the 8010 and the early model 8120s. So look at the videos for that if you have that model. Okay, that's all that I've got for this installation. Please be careful on your systems and still be vigilant for possible other sources of ignition on your machine. Have a safe harvest.